A clue isn't hidden, it's simply overlooked. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
Snow had fallen steadily since morning, transforming Greythorne Manor into something from a Victorian Christmas card. The great stone house stood wrapped in pristine white, its mullioned windows glowing warmly against the gathering dusk of Boxing Day. Inside the oak-panelled drawing-room, a select gathering of local society had assembled for Lady Pemberton's traditional winter charity tea, though the treacherous roads had kept the party smaller and more intimate than usual. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly near the crackling fire, her knitting needles clicking a gentle rhythm as she worked on what appeared to be a sock for her great-nephew. To casual observation, she seemed entirely absorbed in counting stitches, but her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the social dynamics unfolding around her. There was something particularly charged about this gathering, she reflected, like the air before a thunderstorm. Lady Pemberton, elegant in deep burgundy wool, moved among her guests with practiced grace, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tension around her eyes and the way her fingers worried at her pearl necklace. The hostess had been unusually insistent that everyone remain overnight given the weather conditions, an invitation that had carried an almost desperate undertone. Near the grand piano, Dr. Hartwell stood in conversation with Colonel Weatherby, their voices carrying the particular intensity of disagreement beneath polite words. The doctor's wife, a pale creature in dove grey, hovered nearby with the perpetual anxiety of someone expecting catastrophe. She had glanced toward the door no fewer than 6 times in the past quarter hour, Miss Marple observed. "Such dreadful weather for travelling," murmured Mrs. Dolly Bantry, settling beside Miss Marple with her teacup. "Though I must say, being snowed in does create a certain cosy atmosphere, doesn't it?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "Though human nature rarely takes a holiday, even at Christmas, people do carry their troubles with them like unwelcome luggage." The arrival of Mr. Geoffrey Ashton had created a subtle ripple through the room. The London solicitor was impeccably dressed as always, his silver hair perfectly groomed, but Miss Marple detected something brittle in his smile as he greeted Lady Pemberton. Their brief exchange held an undercurrent that made several guests glance their way with poorly concealed curiosity. Young Miss Vivian Ashton, Geoffrey's niece, sat by the window, her engagement ring conspicuously absent from her finger, a detail that had not escaped the notice of Mrs. Pike, the vicar's wife, whose talent for observation rivaled her enthusiasm for sharing it. The girl twisted a length of ribbon around her finger with nervous persistence, creating a red mark that spoke of considerable agitation. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, the comfortable rhythm of well-bred conversation continued, punctuated by the gentle clink of china and the soft whisper of turning pages as Mr. Finch, the visiting historian, remained absorbed in a leather-bound volume near the bookshelf. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the room into darkness save for the dancing flames in the fireplace. How perfectly dramatic. Lady Pemberton's laugh rang out, perhaps a touch too brightly. "Mrs. Hartwell, would you mind checking the fuse box? You know where everything is kept." The darkness lasted barely 3 minutes, but when the electric lights returned, revealing the same faces around the room, Mr. Ashton's chair by the fire stood empty. His brandy glass remained on the side table, still half full, a faint smear of condensation marking where his fingers had gripped it. "Where on earth has Geoffrey gone?" Lady Pemberton's voice carried forced lightness that didn't quite mask her concern. It was Colonel Weatherby who found him 20 minutes later in the small library, slumped in the leather reading chair with his eyes staring sightlessly at the snow-covered garden beyond the French doors. Dr. Hartwell's examination was swift and grim. Geoffrey Ashton was dead, and the bitter almond scent that lingered faintly in the air suggested this was no natural passing. Miss Marple stood quietly in the library doorway, her knitting forgotten in her hands as she observed the scene with the careful attention she might give to an interesting pattern. The snow continued to fall beyond the windows, sealing them all within the walls of Greythorne Manor with a secret that would demand the most delicate unraveling. The library fell into an uneasy quiet as Dr. Hartwell completed his grim examination, his professional demeanor masking what Miss Marple recognized as genuine distress. When he emerged into the drawing room, closing the door with deliberate care behind him, his announcement carried the weight of finality that transformed speculation into terrible certainty. "I'm afraid there can be no doubt," he said, his voice steady despite the slight tremor in his hands. "Geoffrey has been poisoned. The distinctive odor suggests prussic acid, cyanide in common parlance. Death would have been swift, perhaps within minutes of ingestion." Lady Pemberton pressed her handkerchief to her lips, the color draining from her face. "Poisoned? But how is that possible? We were all here together, sharing the same refreshments." "Not quite all the same," Colonel Weatherby interjected with military precision. "Geoffrey was drinking brandy from the sideboard decanter while the rest of us had tea or sherry." His weathered face bore the expression of a man accustomed to assessing tactical situations. The question becomes whether the poison was in the brandy itself or administered separately. Mrs. Hartwell, who had remained unnaturally quiet since returning from the fuse box, spoke in barely audible tones. "I saw him pour the brandy himself, just before the lights failed. He mentioned needing something stronger than tea for what lay ahead." She twisted her gloves with nervous fingers. Those were his exact words. What lay ahead? Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm, though her pale eyes missed nothing of the subtle undercurrents flowing through the room. Young Vivian Ashton sat frozen by the fire, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, her bare ring finger now seeming almost accusatory in its nakedness. The girl's earlier agitation had transformed into something deeper, not merely grief, Miss Marple observed, but an emotion that suggested complicated feelings about her uncle's demise. "We must telephone for Constable Davies immediately," declared Mrs. Pike with the authority of someone well-versed in mystery novels. "Though I fear these roads will prevent anyone reaching us before morning." The practical reality of their isolation settled over the group like a shroud. They were trapped not merely by the snow, but by the presence of a murderer among them. A thought that transformed familiar faces into potential threats and innocent gestures into suspicious movements. "The timing troubles me," mused Mr. Finch, finally looking up from his historical volume. "The power failure provided perfect cover, yet it suggests careful planning rather than spontaneous action." His scholarly detachment seemed oddly inappropriate given the circumstances, though Miss Marple noted how his fingers betrayed nervousness by repeatedly tracing the book's gilt tooling. Dr. Hartwell's jaw tightened. Geoffrey was alone in the library when darkness fell. No one could have approached him without being observed when the lights returned. Could they not? Miss Marple's gentle question drew all attention to her diminutive figure. "I'm afraid my hearing compensates somewhat for failing eyesight, and during those few minutes of darkness, I detected considerable movement. Footsteps, the soft closing of a door, even someone bumping into furniture." The admission sent a visible ripple through the assembled group. Colonel Weatherby nodded grimly. "I noticed movement as well, though with everyone calling out and the general confusion, it was impossible to determine who or where." As if summoned by their discussion, the sound of stamping boots in the entrance hall announced Constable Davies's arrival. The village policeman, more accustomed to settling disputes over property lines than investigating murder, entered with snow dusting his uniform and bewilderment written across his honest face. Within minutes, whispered theories began circulating like autumn leaves in a wind. Mrs. Pike, cornering anyone who would listen, hinted darkly about financial troubles she'd heard rumored in London circles. Colonel Weatherby, with characteristic directness, muttered about passionate affairs gone wrong, his meaningful glances toward Lady Pemberton not going unnoticed. Mrs. Hartwell, ever anxious, suggested a tragic accident. Perhaps Geoffrey had mistaken something for his usual brandy in the confusion. Miss Marple observed how readily each person projected their own experiences onto the tragedy, revealing as much about themselves as about their theories. Dr. Hartwell's clinical focus on the poison's deliberate nature, Vivian's guilty silence, Lady Pemberton's concern for appearances over grief. Each reaction painted a small portrait of character under pressure. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9 times, its resonant notes underscoring their predicament. Outside, the snow continued its relentless fall, sealing them within Greythorne Manor with secrets that demanded unraveling. Miss Marple settled deeper into her chair, her knitting forgotten as she began the delicate work of observing human nature in all its complicated, dangerous forms. The village gossip mill, transplanted to this elegant drawing-room, had begun its inexorable grinding, and within its mechanisms, she suspected, lay the key to Geoffrey Ashton's death. Constable Davies, whose experience with serious crime extended little beyond settling disputes over stolen chickens, approached his task with the methodical determination of a man acutely aware of his limitations. He had wisely sealed the library, though his hands trembled slightly as he handled the brandy decanter, a reaction that spoke volumes about the rarity of murder in their peaceful corner of England. The weight of investigating among the county's social elite clearly pressed upon his shoulders as he consulted his pristine notebook. "I'll need to speak with each of you individually," Davies announced, his voice carrying more confidence than his nervous glances suggested, "to establish everyone's movements during the evening, particularly around the power failure." Lady Pemberton straightened with aristocratic resolve. Geoffrey had been asking rather pointed questions about the manor's history during tea. Something about previous owners and their legal circumstances. Her carefully modulated tone carried an undercurrent that made several guests exchange meaningful looks. Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm, though her pale eyes missed nothing of the subtle reactions rippling through the room. Dr. Hartwell shifted uncomfortably before speaking. Geoffrey mentioned wanting to examine certain documents in the library. He seemed particularly interested in estate records. Said he was setting certain matters right. "Setting matters right," Colonel Weatherby repeated with military precision. "That suggests he'd discovered something requiring immediate correction." Mr. Finch looked up sharply from his historical volume. "Geoffrey approached me earlier about researching the Pemberton family lineage. He believed there might be discrepancies in certain legal documents. I told him such investigations were hardly appropriate for a social gathering." The admission fell into the room like a stone into still water. Miss Marple observed how each person absorbed this information differently. Lady Pemberton's barely perceptible stiffening, Mrs. Hartwell's increased fidgeting with her gloves, Vivian's deeper withdrawal into herself. Young Vivian finally spoke, her voice barely audible. Uncle Geoffrey had been acting strangely for weeks. Mysterious telephone calls, hours locked in his study with old documents. When I asked, he said he was setting certain matters right, but wouldn't elaborate. Her fingers worried at the ribbon around her bare ring finger, creating an angry red mark. Davies scribbled frantically, clearly overwhelmed by the implications. "So Mr. Ashton was investigating. What exactly?" "Estate irregularities, I suspect," Lady Pemberton replied with forced lightness. "My late husband's affairs were complex. Geoffrey had some concerns that could have been resolved through proper channels, but he seemed determined to pursue matters immediately." Miss Marple's attention drifted to Mrs. Hartwell, who had grown increasingly agitated. "You mentioned checking the fuse box during the blackout, my dear. Such a complicated journey in darkness. You must know the house very well." Mrs. Hartwell's response came too quickly. "I helped once before when Lady Pemberton's housekeeper was ill. The basement stairs are treacherous, but I managed with my torch, though it failed part way down." "How fortunate you remembered the way in complete darkness," Miss Marple observed mildly. By her own careful reckoning, Mrs. Hartwell's claim journey would have required remarkable speed, given the maze of corridors and the awkward descent to the basement. Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat. Geoffrey did mention wanting to discuss something privately with several of us this evening. He seemed to believe it concerned everyone present. Everyone? Davies looked up with renewed interest. Before anyone could elaborate, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a detail others had missed. During her earlier examination of the library, she had noticed a small twist of blue paper, the type chemists used for powders, trapped beneath the hearthrug's corner. On the escritoire's blotter, a narrow ring marked where something smaller than a tumbler had rested, leaving a damp impression. "Constable," she said gently, "might I suggest examining not just what was added to Mr. Ashton's drink, but what might have been removed from it? Sometimes the most telling clues are the smallest ones." Mrs. Pike leaned forward conspiratorially. I couldn't help noticing the tension between Geoffrey and Lady Pemberton when he arrived. There was definitely unresolved business between them. The observation hung in the air like incense, sweet but ominous. Outside, the wind rattled the ancient windows while snow continued its relentless accumulation, sealing them within Greythorne Manor with secrets that demanded unraveling. Davies closed his notebook with visible frustration. The obvious solution, poison in the brandy decanter, seemed increasingly inadequate as motives multiplied and testimonies revealed layers of complexity he hadn't anticipated. Miss Marple settled deeper into her chair, her knitting forgotten as she began the delicate work of observing human nature under pressure, knowing that within these nervous gestures and careful words lay the key to Geoffrey Ashton's death. Constable Davies emerged from the library with newfound confidence, his notebook filled with observations that seemed to point toward a coherent solution. The brandy decanter, he announced to the assembled group, showed no trace of poison, confirming that the deadly substance had been administered separately, most likely in a small glass that had since been removed from the scene. "I found something rather significant," Davies declared, producing a crumpled twist of blue paper from his coat pocket. This was discovered near the hearth in the library, partially hidden beneath the edge of the Persian rug. He held it delicately, as if it might explode. "There's a distinct odor of bitter almonds, the telltale sign of prussic acid." Dr. Hartwell straightened in his chair, his professional demeanor masking what Miss Marple recognized as genuine concern. "Constable, such paper is common enough. Chemists use it for dispensing powders of all descriptions. Without proper analysis, you cannot definitively connect it to the crime." "Perhaps not definitively," Davies replied with growing authority, "but combined with other evidence, it forms a compelling picture." He consulted his notes with theatrical precision. "You were absent from the drawing room during the crucial period, Doctor. Your medical knowledge would certainly encompass the properties and administration of various poisons." The accusation hung in the air like incense, sweet but ominous. Mrs. Hartwell's hands trembled as she reached for her teacup, the delicate china chattering against the saucer. Miss Marple observed how the doctor's wife seemed to shrink into herself, as if trying to become invisible under the weight of scrutiny. Lady Pemberton intervened with aristocratic authority. "Constable Davies, surely you're not suggesting that Dr. Hartwell, a respected physician who has served this community faithfully for decades, would commit such a heinous act?" But Davies had tasted the satisfaction of a case falling into place, and he pressed forward. "I'm merely following the evidence, Your Ladyship. The doctor had opportunity, means, and if Mr. Ashton's investigations threaten to expose some medical impropriety, motive as well." Mr. Finch looked up from his historical volume with scholarly interest. "In my experience with criminal cases from the past, Constable, the most obvious solution often obscures more complex truths. Geoffrey Ashton was investigating matters that reached far beyond medical practice." Young Vivian Ashton, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke with startling clarity. Uncle Geoffrey wasn't just concerned with estate irregularities. He'd been corresponding with specialists in London about certain inconsistencies he'd discovered in family records. Deaths that seemed to follow suspicious patterns. The admission sent ripples through the room. Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm, though her pale eyes missed nothing of the subtle reactions. Mrs. Pike leaned forward with barely concealed excitement, while Colonel Weatherby's weathered face grew thoughtful. "What sort of patterns?" Davies asked, his confidence momentarily shaken by this unexpected development. Uncle Geoffrey believed there had been a series of convenient deaths over the years, people who died just as they were about to inherit property or expose uncomfortable truths. Vivian's voice grew stronger as she continued. He'd been building a case, collecting evidence that suggested someone had been systematically eliminating obstacles to their own advancement. Dr. Hartwell's face had grown ashen during this revelation. "Vivian, surely you're not suggesting that I'm not suggesting anything about anyone specifically," she interrupted with surprising firmness. "I'm merely explaining why Uncle Geoffrey was so determined to examine historical records. He believed he was close to identifying a pattern that would expose the truth." Miss Marple observed how each person absorbed this information differently. Lady Pemberton's fingers worried at her pearl necklace with increasing intensity, while Mrs. Hartwell seemed to grow smaller in her chair. The revelation added layers of complexity that transformed simple motives into something far more dangerous. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the ancient windows and underscoring their isolation within Greythorne Manor. The snow continued its relentless accumulation, sealing them within these walls with secrets that demanded unraveling. Davies closed his notebook with visible frustration. What had seemed like a straightforward case of poison administered during a convenient blackout now appeared to be part of a much larger and more sinister pattern. The obvious solution, Dr. Hartwell as the murderer, seemed increasingly inadequate as motives multiplied and testimonies revealed layers of complexity he hadn't anticipated. Miss Marple settled deeper into her chair, her knitting forgotten as she began the delicate work of observing human nature under pressure. She had learned long ago that family secrets, particularly those surrounding death, possessed a peculiar power to generate fresh tragedy. Whatever Geoffrey Ashton had discovered in his investigations, it had clearly reached into the past, with deadly consequences for the present, and the truth lay hidden somewhere within the nervous gestures and careful words of those gathered around her. The weight of Geoffrey Ashton's broader investigation had settled over the drawing room like a shroud, transforming comfortable social gathering into something far more sinister. Miss Marple observed how each person seemed to withdraw into themselves, as if protecting secrets that might suddenly become deadly relevant. While Constable Davies struggled with the mounting complexity of motives and methods, her pale blue eyes remained fixed on details others had dismissed as insignificant. During a particularly tense silence, Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap. "Constable Davies," she said gently, "might I suggest we examine the library once more? Sometimes the smallest details become clearer when viewed with fresh perspective." Davies, grateful for any guidance that might restore his confidence, readily agreed. As they entered the library together, Miss Marple moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that truth often resided in overlooked corners. The bitter almond scent had largely dissipated, but the room still held an atmosphere of violated peace. Her attention returned immediately to the escritoire, where that narrow water ring on the leather blotter continued to intrigue her. Unlike the broad base of Geoffrey's brandy glass, this mark suggested something far more delicate. A cordial glass, perhaps, or even a small medicine tumbler. She placed her gloved fingertip beside the ring, measuring its dimensions with a seamstress's precision. "You see, Constable," she murmured, "this impression tells us that Mr. Ashton consumed something from a vessel quite different from his brandy glass. Something smaller, more concentrated." Davies nodded, his confidence beginning to return as physical evidence emerged. "But where is this smaller glass now?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the French doors, where she noticed something that made her pause. The heavy curtains hung perfectly straight except for a subtle puckering at the lower edge, as if moisture had stiffened the fabric. More telling still, a fine dusting of snow marked the inner windowsill, evidence of the doors having been opened, however briefly. "I believe," she said quietly, "that our murderer was quite tidy in their disposal methods." With Davies's assistance, she carefully unlatched one of the French doors, allowing a breath of frigid air to sweep through the room. Her torch beam swept across the terrace stones and into the pristine snow beyond, searching for what logic suggested must be there. The light caught a tiny glint half buried in the drift at the very edge of the step, a crescent of broken glass no larger than a thumbnail, its edge sharp as winter starlight. Davies retrieved the fragment with reverent care, wrapping it in his handkerchief. "Crystal," he observed, "and recently broken. The edges are still clean." When they returned to the drawing room with their discovery, the atmosphere grew even more charged. Lady Pemberton's fingers worried at her pearl necklace as Davies explained their findings, while Mrs. Hartwell seemed to shrink further into her chair, her dove-grey sleeve bearing what Miss Marple noted was a small dark smudge, like coal dust or soot. "A cordial glass," Lady Pemberton said carefully. "We do keep a set in the library cabinet. Mother-in-law's Waterford crystal. They're used for Christmas ratafia and such occasions." Miss Marple's examination of the cabinet revealed what she had suspected. One glass was missing from an otherwise complete set, its absence marked by a perfect circle in the dust that had accumulated over months of disuse. The careful murderer had selected their weapon with intimate knowledge of the house's contents. Young Vivian Ashton, who had been listening with growing comprehension, suddenly spoke with startling clarity. Uncle Geoffrey always carried a small silver hip flask filled with spring water. He had digestive troubles and never took spirits neat, always diluted them carefully. The revelation transformed their understanding completely. Rather than poison administered during a convenient blackout, Geoffrey's death appeared to be the result of meticulous planning by someone who knew his habits intimately. The murderer had counted on his predictable behavior, using his own caution against him. Dr. Hartwell, despite being under suspicion, provided professional insight. Prussic acid is virtually colorless and nearly odorless when properly diluted. A small amount in spring water would be undetectable until consumption. Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her mind working through the implications. Someone in this room had studied Geoffrey Ashton with deadly precision, had known about his hip flask, his preference for diluted spirits, his habit of using the library for private conversations. The broken crystal in the snow represented not merely evidence of murder, but proof of a calculating mind that had planned not just the killing, but its concealment. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, and snow continued to seal them within Greythorne Manor's increasingly oppressive walls. The murderer sat among them, maintaining their facade of shocked innocence, believing their careful disposal of evidence had eliminated the most dangerous traces of their crime. But Miss Marple, who understood that human nature invariably left trails more revealing than any physical clue, had begun to perceive the true pattern hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly straightforward village tragedy. The implications of Geoffrey Ashton's meticulous murder settled over the drawing room like winter fog, chilling and inescapable. Miss Marple observed how this revelation affected each person differently, some with genuine surprise, others with the careful neutrality of those guarding dangerous secrets. The missing hip flask had become more than evidence. It represented intimate knowledge turned deadly. Constable Davies, emboldened by their discoveries, began a methodical search of Geoffrey's effects. His watch, wallet, and a crumpled railway timetable emerged from various pockets, but the silver hip flask that Vivian insisted never left her uncle's side was conspicuously absent. Someone removed it after his death, Davies concluded grimly, or just before. Either way, Colonel Weatherby observed with military precision, it points to foreknowledge of the flask and its significance to Mr. Ashton's habits. Mrs. Hartwell, who had grown increasingly agitated throughout the evening, suddenly rose from her chair with jerky movements. "This is all speculation and gossip," she declared, her voice higher than usual. "People die of natural causes all the time. To suggest otherwise is monstrous." Miss Marple's pale eyes noted how the woman's dove-gray sleeve bore not just the dark smudge observed earlier, but also a small tear near the wrist, damage consistent with handling broken glass or navigating treacherous passages in darkness. The claim about checking fuse boxes seemed increasingly implausible given the intimate knowledge of Greythorne Manor's labyrinthine basement such a task would require. Lady Pemberton, attempting to restore some semblance of control, spoke with aristocratic precision. Geoffrey had requested access to the Muniment room after tea. Our family papers are kept there. Marriage settlements, chapel registers, correspondence of a delicate nature. He implied there was an error that could be corrected with discretion. Young Vivian, who had been listening with growing comprehension, suddenly spoke with startling clarity. Uncle Geoffrey wasn't just concerned with estate irregularities. He'd been building a case about suspicious deaths over the years, people who died just as they were about to inherit property or expose uncomfortable truths. The admission transformed the atmosphere completely. Mr. Finch looked up from his historical volume with scholarly interest. Geoffrey showed me rather compelling documentation. Birth certificates with suspicious alterations, death certificates signed by physicians who later moved away from the area, wills changed just before convenient deaths occurred. Dr. Hartwell, despite his precarious position as prime suspect, provided clinical insight. If Geoffrey was investigating a pattern of murders, then his own death becomes part of that sequence. Someone was threatened enough by his discoveries to silence him permanently. Miss Marple's attention drifted to details others overlooked. The Muniment room lay adjacent to the library, accessible through a concealed door that showed fresh disturbance in the dust along its sill. Someone comfortable with the house's hidden passages had used that route recently. Someone who knew exactly where to find what Geoffrey had been seeking. "There's something else," Vivian continued, her voice growing stronger. "Uncle Geoffrey kept his most important evidence with him tonight, documents in a blue envelope that proved his theories about the historical deaths. He showed it to me before tea, said it contained proof that would expose everything." Davies consulted his notebook frantically. "This envelope, where is it now?" A thorough search of the library revealed nothing. Like the hip flask and the crystal cordial glass, Geoffrey's crucial evidence had vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of bitter almonds and the growing certainty that they were dealing with someone who planned not just murder, but its perfect concealment. Mrs. Pike, unable to contain her excitement at being part of such drama, leaned forward conspiratorially. If Geoffrey was investigating deaths going back years, surely we should examine who might have been threatened by his discoveries. Outside, the wind rattled the ancient windows while snow continued its relentless accumulation, sealing them within Greythorne Manor with secrets that demanded unraveling. Miss Marple settled deeper into her chair, understanding that they were approaching the dangerous moment when the murderer might feel cornered enough to strike again. The careful disposal of evidence spoke of a methodical mind. But human nature, she knew, invariably left trails more revealing than any physical clue. The truth lay hidden somewhere within the nervous gestures and careful words of those gathered around her, and time was running short to expose it before the storm claimed another victim. The acrid scent of burning paper began as a whisper in the drawing-room's atmosphere, so subtle that Miss Marple initially thought it might be a trick of the wind carrying smoke from the fireplace. But her years of careful observation had taught her to trust such instincts, and she noticed how the smell carried an unmistakable chemical sharpness that spoke of deliberate destruction rather than domestic comfort. Colonel Weatherby, his military training attuned to potential dangers, was the first to voice concern. I say, does anyone else detect smoke? Not from our fire, I think. Something altogether different. The realization struck the group with collective alarm as the scent grew stronger, accompanied now by a faint haze drifting from the direction of the Muniment room. Lady Pemberton rose with aristocratic composure that barely masked her growing panic, while Constable Davies immediately took charge with newfound authority. "Everyone remain calm," he commanded, though his own voice betrayed considerable tension. "Colonel, Dr. Hartwell, we must investigate immediately." Miss Marple observed how each person reacted to this new crisis. Mrs. Hartwell, despite her earlier claims of delicate constitution, moved with surprising alacrity toward the hall, her knowledge of the house's layout evident in her confident navigation. Mr. Finch, the historian, displayed genuine distress that seemed to transcend mere concern for personal safety. His anguish appeared focused specifically on the potential destruction of irreplaceable documents. When they discovered the Muniment, room ablaze, with ancient ledgers and family papers feeding hungry flames that had been deliberately set with what appeared to be lamp oil, the implications became terrifyingly clear. Someone had attempted to destroy whatever evidence Geoffrey Ashton had uncovered in his methodical investigation. The combined efforts of the men, aided by Lady Pemberton's household staff and a chemical extinguisher retrieved with remarkable efficiency by Mrs. Hartwell, brought the fire under control within minutes. But the damage was extensive. Centuries of family records reduced to ash and char, with particular destruction focused on the area where estate documents and genealogical records had been stored. "Quite deliberately set," Colonel Weatherby announced grimly, emerging from the smoke-filled room with soot streaking his weathered face. Someone used an accelerant and knew exactly which documents to target. Miss Marple's attention, however, focused not on the obvious destruction, but on the subtle details others had overlooked. The dust patterns around the concealed door connecting to the library showed multiple disturbances. Not just the recent passage of the arsonist, but earlier movements that suggested someone had been using this route throughout the evening. More telling still, she noticed how Mrs. Hartwell's dove-gray sleeve now bore not just the dark smudge observed earlier, but also a distinctive pattern of soot that suggested direct contact with burning materials. Constable Davies, examining the scene with growing comprehension, discovered among the ashes several partially burned fragments that had escaped complete destruction. A charred corner of blue paper, consistent with Geoffrey's crucial envelope, lay near the hearth. More significantly, the twisted remains of what appeared to be a small silver object, possibly a flask cap, suggested that the physical evidence of the murder had been deliberately destroyed along with the documentary proof. "This changes everything," Davies muttered, his earlier certainty about Dr. Hartwell's guilt now completely undermined. The killer wasn't just covering their tracks, they were eliminating the entire foundation of Mr. Ashton's investigation. Young Vivian, who had been watching the proceedings with growing comprehension, suddenly spoke with startling clarity. Uncle Geoffrey always said that the most dangerous criminals were those who understood that destroying evidence was only half the battle. The other half was creating confusion about what the evidence had proved. Miss Marple noted how this observation affected different members of the group. Lady Pemberton's fingers worried at her pearl necklace with increasing intensity, while Mr. Finch seemed genuinely devastated by the loss of historical documents. But it was Mrs. Hartwell's reaction that proved most revealing. Beneath her apparent distress lay something that looked remarkably like relief. "I'm afraid," Miss Marple said gently, "that we're dealing with someone who has been planning this evening's events far more carefully than we initially supposed. The fire wasn't a desperate reaction to discovery. It was part of a calculated strategy to eliminate both the immediate evidence of tonight's murder and the historical proof that would have exposed a much larger pattern of crimes." Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on Greythorne Manor, sealing them within these walls with a murderer whose desperation was matched only by their cunning. The destruction of the Muniment room had served multiple purposes, eliminating evidence, creating confusion, and demonstrating that they were dealing with someone willing to destroy centuries of history to protect their own secrets. As the group returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple observed how the evening's events had fundamentally altered the dynamics among them. Trust had been replaced by suspicion, and the comfortable facade of social gathering had given way to the grim reality that one among them was a killer whose careful planning extended far beyond a single night's work. The truth lay hidden, not just in what had been destroyed, but in the careful observation of who had known exactly what to destroy and how to do it most effectively. The drawing room, though restored to superficial order after the Muniment room crisis, carried an atmosphere fundamentally altered by the evening's revelations. Miss Marple observed how the comfortable social arrangements had dissolved into something far more guarded, with each person now positioned as if expecting attack from unexpected quarters. The acrid scent of burned documents lingered despite Lady Pemberton's efforts to restore normalcy through the ritual of fresh tea service. Mrs. Hartwell, despite her earlier protestations of delicate constitution, had settled back into her chair with movements that spoke of considerable recent exertion. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes noted how the woman's dove-grey sleeve bore not merely the soot stains one might expect from firefighting efforts, but also older marks, small yellowish spots that suggested familiarity with chemical substances extending far beyond tonight's emergency. "My dear Mrs. Hartwell," Miss Marple said gently, rising to examine the damaged fabric with the concerned attention of one woman for another's wardrobe mishap. "Your sleeve has suffered dreadfully in tonight's excitement. That tear near the wrist looks particularly troublesome, almost as if you'd caught it on broken glass or sharp metal." Mrs. Hartwell's response came too quickly, her hands instinctively moving to cover the damage. "Oh, it's nothing at all. The Muniment room was terribly chaotic, and I'm afraid I was rather clumsy in the smoke and confusion." "How remarkably efficient you were, though," Miss Marple continued with characteristic mildness, "navigating those corridors in near darkness to locate the chemical extinguisher. Such presence of mind suggests considerable familiarity with Greythorne Manor's layout." The observation sent a visible ripple through Mrs. Hartwell's composure. "Well, I've visited occasionally over the years. One picks up these things naturally." Lady Pemberton, overhearing this modest disclaimer, looked genuinely puzzled. "My dear, surely you're being far too humble. You've been wonderfully helpful on so many occasions, during my husband's final illness, when we needed someone with nursing experience, and again during that dreadful period when old Mrs. Pemberton required constant medical attention." The contradiction hung in the air like smoke from the earlier fire. Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Hartwell's face had grown ashen, while Dr. Hartwell watched his wife with the dawning comprehension of someone recognizing familiar patterns in an unexpected context. "Medical attention," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. How fortunate that Lady Pemberton had access to someone with such specialized knowledge during those difficult periods. It must have been comforting to have assistance from someone who understood the proper administration of various medications and treatments. Mrs. Hartwell's hands had begun to tremble slightly, the chemical stains on her fingers now seeming almost accusatory in the lamplight. "I merely helped where I could. Nothing more than any neighbor would do." But Colonel Weatherby, his military mind engaging with tactical implications, spoke with growing certainty. "If we're examining who has had consistent access to this house, intimate knowledge of family affairs, and opportunity to observe potential obstacles to various inheritances, then we should consider who was present during each of the suspicious deaths Geoffrey was investigating." Young Vivian, who had been listening with increasing comprehension, added quietly, "Uncle Geoffrey mentioned that his investigation had identified someone who had been hiding in plain sight for years, using their position of trust to eliminate people who threatened their carefully constructed plans." Miss Marple's attention focused on details others might dismiss as insignificant. Mrs. Hartwell's intimate knowledge of the manor's hidden passages, her efficient location of firefighting equipment, her presence during multiple family medical crises, each element formed part of a pattern that Geoffrey Ashton had apparently been close to exposing. "The fire tonight," Miss Marple observed gently, "required not just access to the muniment room, but specific knowledge of which documents pose the greatest threat. Someone familiar with the family's most dangerous secrets would know exactly what needed to be destroyed." Mrs. Hartwell's composure finally began to crack under the accumulated weight of observation and implication. Her earlier confidence had given way to something approaching desperation, though she still maintained her facade of innocent bewilderment. Dr. Hartwell, watching his wife with professional concern, spoke slowly. The pattern Geoffrey described, convenient deaths occurring just as certain individuals were about to inherit property or expose uncomfortable truths, would require someone with medical knowledge, social access, and intimate familiarity with family dynamics. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on Greythorne Manor, sealing them within these walls with a truth that demanded careful extraction. Miss Marple settled deeper into her chair, understanding that they had reached the delicate moment when gentle psychological pressure must be applied with surgical precision. The murderer sat among them, still clinging to their carefully constructed identity, but human nature, as she had learned through decades of patient observation, invariably revealed itself when subjected to the right combination of evidence and insight. The truth about Geoffrey Ashton's death lay not in the destroyed documents, but in the careful study of who had possessed both the knowledge to destroy them and the desperate need to do so. The psychological pressure that had been building throughout the evening reached its delicate crescendo as Miss Marple continued her characteristic gentle interrogation. Her knitting needles remained still in her lap, though her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the subtle transformations occurring in Mrs. Hartwell's increasingly fragile composure. "You know," Miss Marple began with her trademark mildness, "this reminds me of a case we had in St. Mary Mead involving a perfectly respectable housekeeper who had been with her employer for years. Such a devoted woman, always so helpful during family crises. No one suspected a thing until it became clear that her intimate knowledge of the household had been turned to rather different purposes than anyone imagined." Mrs. Hartwell's teacup rattled against its saucer with such intensity that the delicate percussion seemed to mark time toward an inevitable revelation. The chemical stains on her fingers had become more pronounced as perspiration made them run slightly, creating yellowish streaks that spoke of habitual contact with dangerous substances. "The remarkable thing about truly helpful people," Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying that deceptive gentleness that had unraveled so many carefully constructed deceptions, "is how they become almost invisible in their usefulness. They know where everything is kept, they understand family routines, they're present during the most vulnerable moments without anyone thinking to question their presence." Lady Pemberton, following this line of reasoning with growing comprehension, added her own observations. "Now that I consider it more carefully, you have been wonderfully present during so many of our family's most difficult periods, Mrs. Hartwell. When my husband's uncle died so unexpectedly, when Cousin Margaret passed away during her visit, when old Mrs. Pemberton required such intensive nursing care." Dr. Hartwell watched his wife with a dawning horror of professional recognition. His medical training had taught him to observe symptoms of extreme psychological stress, and Mrs. Hartwell exhibited all the classic signs of someone approaching complete breakdown under systematic interrogation. "The timing of your various movements this evening has been quite instructive," Miss Marple observed with devastating mildness. "Present during the power failure to check those troublesome fuses, absent again when the muniment room fire began, and throughout it all, displaying an intimate knowledge of Greythorne Manor's hidden passages that suggests far more extensive familiarity than casual social visits would provide." Young Vivian, who had been listening with increasing clarity, spoke quietly. Uncle Geoffrey said the person he was investigating had been hiding in plain sight for years, using their position of trust to eliminate obstacles during their most vulnerable moments. Someone who could administer poison under the guise of providing comfort or medical assistance. The accumulation of these observations created a suffocating atmosphere in the drawing room. Mrs. Hartwell seemed to physically diminish with each revelation, her dove-grey dress making her appear almost spectral in the lamplight. The torn fabric near her wrist, the soot stains, the suspicious efficiency with which she had navigated the manor's labyrinthine passages. Each detail formed part of a pattern that Geoffrey Ashton had apparently been close to exposing. "The prussic acid used tonight," Dr. Hartwell said slowly. His professional knowledge now turned toward examining his wife's actions with clinical detachment, "would require specific knowledge of dosage and timing. It's not something one handles casually or acquires without considerable planning and experience." Miss Marple's attention focused on the smallest details that others might dismiss. "It would require very particular knowledge to replace the contents of a gentleman's hip flask. Someone who understood his habits intimately, knew about his digestive troubles, his preference for diluted spirits. Someone who could time the administration perfectly and then dispose of the evidence with such methodical thoroughness." Mrs. Hartwell's carefully maintained facade began to crack under this accumulated pressure. Her hands, which had been trembling throughout the evening, now moved with sudden, desperate energy. The gentle bewilderment that had masked her features all evening gave way to something altogether different, a calculating intelligence that had been carefully concealed beneath layers of practiced domestic helpfulness. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," she said, her voice carrying an authority none of them had heard before. The transformation was so complete that she seemed like an entirely different person, as if years of careful deception had finally been discarded to reveal the predator beneath. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on Greythorne Manor, but inside the drawing room, the real tempest was just beginning to reveal its full destructive potential. Miss Marple settled deeper into her chair, understanding that they had reached the moment when gentle psychological pressure must give way to direct confrontation with a mind that had planned multiple murders with methodical precision. The truth about Geoffrey Ashton's death, and the pattern of convenient deaths he had been investigating, lay trembling on the edge of complete exposure. The psychological pressure that had been building throughout the evening reached its delicate crescendo as Mrs. Hartwell's carefully maintained facade began to crack under Miss Marple's characteristic, gentle interrogation. The transformation was subtle at first, a sharpening of the eyes, a straightening of the shoulders, but gradually revealed someone whose calculating intelligence had been concealed beneath decades of practiced domestic helpfulness. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Mrs. Hartwell repeated, her voice carrying an authority that none of them had heard before. The gentle, anxious woman who had spent the evening worrying her gloves and speaking in barely audible whispers seemed to dissolve, replaced by someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions with clinical precision. Miss Marple observed this transformation with the patient attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. Her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the subtle changes. The way Mrs. Hartwell's hands had stopped trembling and now moved with purposeful control, how her voice had gained confidence even as her position grew more precarious. "You know," Miss Marple began with her trademark mildness, "this reminds me of a case we had in St. Mary Mead involving a perfectly respectable woman who had been with her employers for years. Such devoted service during family crises. The remarkable thing about truly helpful people is how they become almost invisible in their usefulness, present during the most vulnerable moments without anyone thinking to question their presence." She gestured gently toward Mrs. Hartwell's torn sleeve. "That damage near your wrist troubles me, my dear. It's precisely the sort of tear one might sustain from handling broken crystal, say, when disposing of a cordial glass in haste. And those yellowish stains on your fingers speak of familiarity with chemical substances extending far beyond tonight's emergency. Constable Davies, following Miss Marple's subtle direction, had quietly dispatched Colonel Weatherby to examine the east cloakroom cistern. Their return brought tangible proof. A small silver flask cap retrieved from the water, along with fragments of royal blue paper that Mr. Finch immediately identified as matching Geoffrey's distinctive envelope stock. "The timing of your various movements this evening has been quite instructive," Miss Marple continued with devastating gentleness. "Present during the power failure to check those troublesome fuses, absent again when the Muniment room fire began, and throughout it all displaying intimate knowledge of Greythorne Manor's hidden passages that suggests far more extensive familiarity than casual social visits would provide." Lady Pemberton, following this line of reasoning with growing comprehension, added her own observations. "Now that I consider it more carefully, you have been wonderfully present during so many of our family's most difficult periods, Mrs. Hartwell. When my husband's uncle died so unexpectedly, when Cousin Margaret passed away during her visit, when old Mrs. Pemberton required such intensive nursing care." Young Vivian spoke quietly but with startling clarity. "Uncle Geoffrey said the person he was investigating had been hiding in plain sight for years, using their position of trust to eliminate obstacles during their most vulnerable moments. Someone who could administer treatments under the guise of providing comfort or medical assistance." The accumulation of evidence created a suffocating atmosphere in the drawing room. Mrs. Hartwell seemed to physically diminish under the weight of observation, yet something defiant flickered in her eyes, the look of someone who had survived by her wits for too long to surrender easily. Geoffrey was remarkably thorough in his research, she admitted finally, her voice carrying grudging respect. He had identified certain patterns in family histories, convenient deaths that cleared obstacles or secured inheritances, but research and proof are entirely different matters. Dr. Hartwell watched his wife with the dawning horror of professional recognition. The medical knowledge required, the access to substances, the intimate familiarity with patients' routines. Someone had to ensure proper order, Mrs. Hartwell continued with chilling matter-of-factness. Weak people who squander inheritances, who threaten established arrangements with inconvenient suspicions or investigations. The hip flask was particularly straightforward. Geoffrey's digestive troubles made him predictably cautious about his alcohol consumption. Miss Marple settled deeper into her chair, understanding that they had witnessed something far more complex than simple murder. "I'm afraid we're dealing with someone who has been managing these situations for years, using nursing skills and social position to eliminate threats to carefully constructed arrangements. The prussic acid, the knowledge of Geoffrey's habits, the methodical disposal of evidence, all speak to considerable experience in such matters." "You'll never prove enough," Mrs. Hartwell said with renewed confidence, her defiance reasserting itself. "Circumstantial evidence and village gossip against a respected woman who has devoted herself to caring for others." "Perhaps not tonight," Miss Marple replied, gently. But Geoffrey was quite thorough in his preparations. Solicitors are wonderfully reliable about opening sealed documents when their clients fail to collect them as arranged. Morning will bring proper authorities, and I suspect they will find his evidence rather more comprehensive than you might hope. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on Greythorne Manor, sealing them within these walls with a truth that demanded careful preservation until dawn. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, marking time until proper justice could arrive with the morning light. The murderer sat among them still, her careful facade finally cracked, but not completely shattered, understanding that her years of hiding behind helpful domesticity had reached their inevitable end. The truth about Geoffrey Ashton's death had revealed something much darker, a systematic campaign of elimination that had masqueraded as compassionate care, now exposed by the patient observation of human nature in all its dangerous complexity. The grandfather clock chimed midnight as Mrs. Hartwell's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled under Miss Marple's gentle but relentless pressure. The transformation from anxious helpmate to calculating predator was now complete, revealing someone whose twisted sense of duty had justified decades of systematic murder as mere household management. Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm as she delivered the final, devastating explanation. "You see, my dear Mrs. Hartwell, Geoffrey's investigation revealed something far more sinister than a single murder. He had documented a pattern spanning 30 years. Convenient deaths that always eliminated obstacles to inheritance or threatened to expose uncomfortable arrangements. Each victim died just when they posed the greatest threat to established order." Her pale blue eyes missed nothing of Mrs. Hartwell's reactions as she continued. "Lady Pemberton's husband's uncle, who died before challenging the estate settlement. Cousin Margaret, whose awkward questions about family finances ended with her sudden passing. Old Mrs. Pemberton, whose final illness required such intensive nursing care just as she considered changing her will. You were present for every death, always in a role that removed suspicion. The devoted nurse, the helpful neighbor, the pillar of community virtue." Dr. Hartwell watched his wife with horrified recognition. "The positioning you insisted upon during nursing duties, always handling medications personally, always present during critical moments. I thought it was dedication, but it was control." Young Vivian's voice cut through the tension with startling clarity. "Uncle Geoffrey called it the Hartwell pattern. Every suspicious death had your involvement, your medical knowledge, your intimate access during vulnerable moments." Mrs. Hartwell's defiance flickered one final time before collapsing entirely. 37 years of service," she said with chilling matter-of-factness. "Cleaning up other people's messes, ensuring proper order when weak people threatened established arrangements. Someone had to manage these situations properly." Miss Marple observed how the confession revealed not madness, but a perverted sense of duty. "Geoffrey's hip flask was particularly straightforward, wasn't it? His digestive troubles made him predictably cautious about alcohol consumption. You simply replaced his spring water with prussic acid, knowing he would dilute his brandy as usual. The power failure provided perfect cover for accessing the library and disposing of evidence. The Muniment room fire became necessary when I realized he'd brought those damaging documents." Mrs. Hartwell continued with professional pride. "The blue envelope contained copies of everything: birth certificates with alterations, death certificates signed by physicians who conveniently moved away, wills changed just before convenient deaths. I had to eliminate the evidence." The admission struck the room like lightning. Lady Pemberton pressed her handkerchief to her lips, while Dr. Hartwell sat frozen, his world irrevocably shattered by the magnitude of his wife's deception. Dawn's first light began filtering through the snow-covered windows when Inspector Kersey arrived with the morning patrol, his motor car following the plow up the drifted drive. The inspector, pragmatic and experienced, took in the situation with professional efficiency, listening as Constable Davies recounted the night's revelations with newfound confidence. "Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell," Davies announced with steady authority, "I arrest you for the murder of Geoffrey Ashton and on suspicion of multiple other deaths. You need not say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Mrs. Hartwell submitted to arrest with resigned dignity. Her years of hiding behind helpful domesticity finally ended. She walked between the policemen with the same efficient discretion that had shielded her crimes, maintaining her conviction that her actions had been justified by necessity and proper order. As the police motor car disappeared down the snow-covered drive, Greythorne Manor seemed to exhale collectively, releasing the tension that had gripped it throughout the night. The morning light revealed roads that would soon allow normal life to resume, though the events had forever altered the house's atmosphere. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with characteristic composure, reflecting on the peculiar nature of evil that masquerades as virtue. Mrs. Hartwell had genuinely believed herself to be protecting established order, eliminating threats to stability with the same methodical care she brought to nursing duties. "The most dangerous criminals," she observed gently, "are often those who convince themselves they're acting for the greater good. Human nature, in all its dangerous complexity, reveals itself through the smallest details when subjected to patient observation. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, covering the tracks of the night's revelations with pristine whiteness. The truth would endure long after winter's concealment melted away, preserved in Geoffrey Ashton's carefully documented evidence and in the memories of those who had witnessed justice emerge from the gentle persistence of an elderly lady with sharp eyes and clicking knitting needles. The village would return to its peaceful routine, though with the sobering knowledge that evil could hide behind the most respectable facades, requiring eternal vigilance to detect and expose.